Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, John Meuret explains how interest rates could impact U.S. corn and soybean exports. Todd Neeley outlines the EPA's proposed renewable fuel volumes for 2017. Tamra Jackson-Ziems describes corn seedling diseases, and Al Dutcher forecasts rain chances over the next week. John Meuret from Meuret Grain Company is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA's first corn condition ratings of the season show 72% of the crop listed in the categories of good to excellent. Nebraska matches that total. Nationwide, 94% of the country's corn has been planted, 2 points ahead of normal. Farmers in this state have nearly caught up to their usual pace. They're 96% finished, which is 1 point behind the 5-year average. We talked with John Wednesday afternoon in Brunswick and started by asking for an update on crop conditions and planting progress in his area of northeast Nebraska.
Jeff, we're pretty well done planting. There's a little replant stuff and maybe some finish up acres in eastern Nebraska where it's been wet, but I'm going to say everything 90 miles west and that direction is all done. Conditions look really pretty good, all things considered. So the early corn's looking okay, and the late corn's quickly catching up, it looks like. So
let's talk about the strength in the market. Wednesday was another good day. What is it coming from? Is it coming from funds? Is it coming from fundamentals? Is it coming from weather? Pick one.
I think all of the above, Jeff. I think it's fair to say that a little bit of it's money inflow, a little bit of it's weather. There's some concern still on La Nina this summer. Some of it's Brazil. Brazil's got some issues with their corn crop down there. Their corn price has doubled in the last 2 months, and so that's making people pay attention here in North America. And I don't know that we're going to run out of corn, but at least it's something that warrants a little watching. And then on beans, you go farther south, Argentina's got some harvesting issues or had some harvesting issues, and so they've maybe got some quality concerns on the soybean meal they're trying to get rid of. So
let me ask the question a different way for people that are thinking that this can
Sure.
still go up. How much of it is fundamentals versus the other things?
I'm going to say about 20% is fundamentals, and remember, it's a futures market, so it's always trying to trade 3, 4, 6, 8, 10 months away. And so yes, today we don't have an issue, but the market's fully aware that it can't wait till the last day and then rally. So we're going to price in some of this concern, and we're going to see how the weather unfolds this summer, Jeff.
Going down to Brazil, how much of a problem do you think that corn crop is?
It's a big problem. It's a big problem. You've got the farmer that's oversold, or he feels like he's oversold, so he's wanting to buy back some of the commitments he's made, and the crop damage isn't done in the northern parts of Brazil. So it's a large problem, and what it's doing is focusing some business back to the U.S. Not a lot, but a little bit, and if that problem continues for them, we'll be able to pick up quite a little business.
Is there any concern over the border with the soybean crop in Argentina?
Yeah, there's certainly some problems in the soybean crop. I don't know that it's a quantity loss. I think it's quality. And again, they're going to worry about their export commitments on meal and make sure, they are the world's biggest meal exporter. So it's going to be important that they get figured out what they have and how to make sure they can continue to sell meal.
Is it too small to have an impact bringing buyers back to the U.S. if there's anything left here?
No, not at all. I think there's certainly some room to bring it back to the U.S., but the buyers have been really patient, and they're patient because of the feed wheat in the world. So if we didn't have the feed wheat problem, I'd be telling you we're going to have a really nice summer exporting corn. But because there's feed wheat in the world, we get beat every day. Now, there's some buyers that aren't going to buy that. They're going to come to the U.S., but we're still going to struggle to really get rid of the surplus corn we have this summer.
I want to talk about the Federal Reserve and whether or not they raise interest rates. Tell me what the impact is when they raise interest rates, what that impact is on U.S. commodity exports.
Well, the thought is if they raise interest rates, we're going to have a higher dollar. And if we have the higher dollar, that should slow down U.S. business out of the country. However, I'm not sure they're going to raise interest rates. And I know the Fed has kind of said they're going to raise them 2 more times this year, 1 more time. And I'm not sure we're quite ready for that. So I'm actually neutral to bearish the dollar, which I think will continue to support the exports. And to be quite frank with you, I think the business is going to be here irregardless of what happens to the dollar this summer.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Because?
A certain amount of it's going to come out of the coast no matter what. You know, the dollar moves are more longer term, and so yes, it'll put us at a disadvantage on the feed wheat we spoke about, but I still think the corn business and the bean business has got to come back to the U.S. by the 1st of August.
Yeah, that's a valid point, or at least something to bring up. If the Fed would raise interest rates, when does it have an impact?
It's really long term, but it's a good question, Jeff. I mean, it's 9-12 months away, and so it's really a long tail to have that impact you're talking about in the exports.
All right, going back to the domestic market here for corn and soybeans, at what level here do you think that farmers should put more sales on the books?
It's been hard, Jeff. I mean, I was wrong 3 months ago with everybody else on beans. Everybody thought they'd stay cheap, and they didn't. You get meal at $400 tonight. So the farmer feels like he's sold too much for the beans, and so he's got to maybe make some catch-up sales on the corn, but the beans he's pretty comfortable for a while. And to answer your question, when you get corn to 4 1/4 December futures, you probably need to re-engage. You know, you're going to be above the cost of production in a lot of cases, and we're not out of the woods yet with a surplus corn.
Is there a 2017 price target that you think producers should at least look at or try to set targets for?
Well, it's going to make it really difficult because you're going to have this December be higher priced than the December 17, and the beans are already $1 some cheaper. So it's going to make it really hard for the farmer to engage out there. But I think he needs to focus on this year's crop, sell himself to his level he's comfortable, and then he can start to look at the 17 depending on his cost of production. You know, fertilizer has stayed cheap, Jeff. I think that'll help these guys, but we don't know what 17 is going to bring.
John, where's basis at in this area, and where do you expect it to move here as we go through the growing season?
It's still weak, Jeff. It's been weak and hasn't really moved since October last year. Corn feels like it can improve a little bit. You know, today I would say we're 10 to 15 cents below a long-term average. But you know, you got a farmer that was undersold and has flooded the market, an ethanol plant that's got all the corn he wants, and an export market that's just starting to pick up, Jeff. So I think we can pick some up on the corn. Beans are also weak today, in fact historically weak, but they're making a comeback. It's been quiet for the last 10 days. The farmer's been finishing planting, and so I think that'll come back a little bit as well.
This market rally, has it chased more corn into the elevator?
A little bit, but I think the farmer needs to sit down and think about, okay, what do I have? I didn't think I'd get the rally, and so he wasn't ready for it. But I think in the next 2 weeks he'll be ready.
Supply and demand estimates out next week for the June crop report. Any expectations?
Yeah, I think the bean carryout's going to be smaller. It's a dart throw for the USDA, but I think they're going to try to take the carryout down this summer in the beans. Corn's going to still struggle to get much below 2 billion bushels. So we have plenty of corn, and beans I think are going to be the driver next week.
Later on in the month, June 30th, Acreage report and grain stocks. First on Acreage, specifically on Acreage, I guess, do you have a thought if there will be more soybean acres than the market expects or than we had last time?
Well, it's a wide range of guesses, Jeff. It's a great question, but I think you're still going to see 2 to 2.5 million acres of beans move in, and corn will give up most of that. But some of the acres are going to come from the acreage pie in general. There's a little more acres around, I think, than they had accounted for at the end of March, and I think we'll see some of those come back into the market.
That's probably an important distinction, right? Because some analysts are saying more bean acres, but not necessarily at the expense of corn.
Correct, and that's got big implications, because if we say that the pie is bigger, the acreage pie is bigger, we're going to have plenty of acres of everything. And then if you start throwing on the double crop bean acres following wheat, I think you've got potentially a bearish outlook on beans after that.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. Nebraska farmers continue to trail their 5-year averages for planting progress as widespread rains have helped keep growers out of fields for stretches of the early growing season. Nebraska Farm Service Agency State Executive Director Dan Steinkruger says those corn producers who may have been delayed should be aware of reporting prevented planting acres to the FSA by June 9th.
I think the main thing is that they report those acres to their crop insurance agent as they need to, and then at the Farm Service Agency, we ask that those acres be reported 15 days after the end planting date of May 25th for corn. So if an individual has a significant acreage, they need to make sure they report that acreage. If we have a loss, they need to report it to their insurance agent, of course, and then report it to FSA. The need for FSA is if they're going to plant a different crop to that acreage.
The final planting date for soybeans in much of Nebraska is June 10th. Dan says the acreage reporting deadline is July 15th. Additionally, the sign-up period for 2016 ARC and PLC farm programs ends August 1st. The Environmental Protection Agency has released its proposed renewable fuel volumes for 2017. The agency put out final requirements for 2014, 2015, and 2016 late last year. For 2017, the EPA is aiming for renewable fuel standard volumes of 2 billion gallons of biodiesel, 312 million gallons of cellulosic ethanol, and a resulting 14.8 billion gallons of corn ethanol. Overall, the RFS total would be 18.8 billion gallons, far below the original goal of 24 billion set in 2007. However, the amount of ethanol derived from corn in 2017 wouldn't be too far from the original requirement. Todd Neeley covers policy and renewable fuels for DTN. We talked with him earlier this week and began by asking how close the 2017 proposals were to expectations.
I think if you talk to the people in the industry, they'll say this isn't good enough. It's kind of an ongoing mantra in the past few years. EPA has been very slow in the way that they implement the law. They've been oftentimes 2 to 3 years behind. I think we're seeing them catch up now. But when you look at what came out, I think it's it's relatively positive considering where this industry's been.
How's the blend wall impacting the targets for corn-based ethanol?
Well, I think we're seeing that move a little bit. This proposal that's come out, it's going to be within a couple 100 million gallons of what corn ethanol is originally supposed to be at this point. And so I think when you look at the numbers and you hear a little bit of the industry talk about it, this is probably going to get us through the blend wall. Of course, when you add cellulosic ethanol and some of these other things in, there's going to have to be room for it. And so the only way to do that is to get through the blend wall.
What helps you get past that blend wall? Is it the exports? Is it using higher blends?
I think at this point it's a little of both. We've seen a very slow growth in E15. I think we're going to continue to see that. It's kind of a grassroots effort that the industry is putting on itself. They're not getting a lot of help from EPA. But I think as you go forward, I think we're going to see some exports pick up. I mean, there's always that export market. We've seen the industry go on a variety of trade missions in recent months, and I think some of those are going to end up turning out some good results.
If you look at that original target, like you mentioned, of 15 and at 14.8 now, there's a chance that for the 2018 mandates, they could get there, right? Absolutely.
And I think, the way we've seen with this industry, it tends to at times overproduce. Obviously, the margins have been tight lately, so it's kind of a question as to whether it's even worth it at times. But I think right now, the way things are going, the margins are slowly improving. We're seeing some movement there. And I fully expect we'll see that they'll meet those targets and maybe even go a bit above.
What's the state of the cellulosic industry right now?
Well, it's kind of a drama. We've seen it in the past 10 years. It's just been an up and down. This latest RFS proposal, it does provide some growth at about roughly 82 million gallons more than the previous year. But we've seen the company Abengoa, based in Spain, they're going through bankruptcy right now. Their plant in Hugoton, Kansas isn't producing and probably won't be for the foreseeable future. So meeting the target on cellulosic ethanol, I think at 312 million gallons is quite a stretch, but I think there are enough smaller companies out there producing gallons that can add to it.
What has been the hindrance to that industry?
It's been a lot of things. We had the economic slowdown back in 2008. We've seen a lot of these companies, they've really struggled to get what they call through this valley of death. Where a company is looking for the necessary funds to get over the technology hump. We've seen that happen. I mean, they've overcome a lot of those challenges, but now it's really getting this thing up to commercial scale, getting enough investors and getting enough interest, and then having a more robust RFS.
What kind of position is biodiesel in after these proposals?
It's disappointing. The industry itself is saying that it's on track in the next couple of years to produce 2.5 billion gallons. This proposal only gets it up to about 2.1, and so I think there's still going to be some wrangling going on with that. The biodiesel industry also is involved in a lawsuit challenging EPA on the RFS, and so I think that a lot of people are waiting to see how that lawsuit plays out. That's what's really going to determine what's going to happen, I think.
Can you explain the value of biodiesel in terms of it filling that advanced biofuel category of the mandate?
Yeah, right now it is considered to be the only commercially viable advanced biofuel. That's because it's produced using a lot of biomass materials as well. And so that's one of the things that the industry brags about. You know, you hear a lot about these next generation, you know, these drop-in fuels like biobutanol and all these things kind of being bragged about. But this industry does have that on its side. It's in the RFS, that it has a place in the RFS that a lot of current commercially produced fuels don't.
Describe the funding proposals from the USDA, or the funding from the USDA that could help that industry.
Well, yeah, we saw another round of funding come out. It's not a big total. It's about $8 million from USDA and a special program that they provide. More than half of the recipients in that program were biodiesel companies, or companies that are thinking about getting into it a little bit. And you know, every little bit helps. I think every time you see another award like this comes out, it really does make it makes a bigger difference than what a lot of people will suggest.
Recap for me, you mentioned it, but the positions from both sides on this proposal, where they stand.
Well, I think if you talk to, it depends on the group you talk to. I know Growth Energy, one of the ethanol groups in DC, when the last proposal came out, they were somewhat excited by it. But I think overall, people by and large are still greatly disappointed. You know, and unfortunately, it really is going to come down to a court case. I think if the court in DC takes this case as far as it goes, I think what we're going to end up seeing is we're going to see that EPA probably hasn't done what it should. Now, whether that, you know, results in, you know, the industry getting what it wants is a whole other story.
When you say hasn't done what it should, does that mean not living up to what was originally set?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, without that robust RFS and the numbers that were set forth years ago, you know, it's really difficult to say what's going to happen to the industry.
The comment period for this proposal runs through July 11th. On the Market Journal website, we'll link to more information about potential volumes and submitting comments. As we mentioned earlier, the USDA will release its latest round of supply and demand estimates next week, but the end of the month will feature arguably one of the bigger reports of the year. On June 30th, the agency will give its results of planted acreage across the country. It'll also release its latest quarterly grain stocks estimate on that date. These are survey-based reports, meaning producers may have received mailings from the agency requesting their input. Dean Groskurth, the director of Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service, explains the importance of farmers responding by the deadline.
This is the first survey-based indications for acreage planted in Nebraska this year. We'll be talking to about 4,800 producers out there to see what they planted, and we'll also be doing about 466 segments, which is about a square mile, enumerating all the crops and information in those areas. As with all USDA NASS surveys, they are unbiased surveys directly from the producers, and if there's other people predicting what they're going to be, once our report comes out, say this June 30th with our acreage and stocks, it'll be the truth, and that's what the marketplace will deal with. On March 30th, we put out a prospective planting. This is what producers were intending to plant. And now we want to know exactly what did they plant. A lot of things happen, prices change, inputs could have changed, and all kinds of different things, foreign markets and exports and imports. And so now they've had the time to make a decision, and this will be what they actually planted.
The USDA's reports on quarterly grain stocks and planted acreage are scheduled to be released Thursday, June 30th at 11 a.m. Central Time. The June Nebraska farmer says Kevin Meadow has been seeing double for 10 years now. In 2005, he bought his first twin row planter and is now on his second. Meadow, who farms in Butler and Seward counties, plants with as many as 5 different row spacings and 4 different pieces of equipment depending on the year, site, and crop rotation. Each row spacing and machine has its own special purpose and provides flexibility in his crop rotation. You can read more about Meadow and his planting systems in the June Nebraska Farmer. Of the 96% of Nebraska's corn that's been planted, 78% has emerged according to the latest USDA progress report. 72% is rated good to excellent, matching the national average. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says growers can now be scouting fields for signs of seedling diseases. We talked with Tamra Wednesday about what problems farmers might be noticing.
We're continuing to see seedling disease develop in cornfields all the way across Nebraska to varying extent. Some very light seedling diseases here and there, and some that are more severe.
Are there specific areas of the field that might be problematic?
Well, a lot of these diseases and the pathogens that cause them are favored by the wet conditions that we've had, and the conditions have slowed down corn growth in some areas, and so that's predisposed them to seedling diseases, and we've got several that we are prone to see right now.
Before you mention any specific ones, how would you know if you should be scouting or what to scout when you go out there?
I think it's a good idea for everybody across the state to be mindful that there could be some problems this spring. We're not out of the woods yet, and so we hope that they'll get out and monitor these fields, especially in areas where we've had repeated and continuous wet conditions. So while people are monitoring their fields and their stand establishment, I'd look for what might look like skips, having healthy plants and then suddenly a missing plant or a shorter, more stunted plant, and maybe even one that's discolored. And so what they probably ought to do is try to dig that plant up and take a closer look, or dig in that gap to see if it was actually a planter issue or if there is a struggling seedling or a rotten one down below. And so to look for rotting roots or sunken discoloration and lesions, and also we call it post or pre-emergence damping off. So all of these are symptoms that you can see with seedling diseases.
Let's look at a few of them and start with Pythium. What will Pythium look like?
Well, Pythium is the one in particular that's probably going to be more common in the wet conditions. It produces spores that swim in the water, and they're attracted to the roots, and so in these wet conditions, that's one that we tend to see more often. But all three of the main ones have very similar symptoms, and so I don't think it's going to be practical or possible for many people to tell them apart.
What are the other two then, other than Pythium?
Well, we also have Fusarium, and there's several species of Fusarium, the fungus that can cause seedling disease, and also Rhizoctonia that can appear as well.
And so if you go out to the field, you notice you have some stand problems, what should you do with those samples?
Well, if they want a diagnosis, they can submit it to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic or their local plant clinic and get a diagnosis. But what they really ought to do is make sure that they do have good stand establishment and make sure they don't need to replant. And so I would monitor their populations.
Anything specific to know when you send in a sample, if you send in a sample?
Yes, we always recommend sending samples in a plastic bag and have them shipped as quickly as you can so that the clinic will receive the highest quality samples and give you the best diagnosis possible.
You mentioned earlier that we're not out of the woods yet. At what point are we out of the woods?
Well, as the plants grow and get larger and as temperatures warm up and we have our more normal conditions, they'll be more likely to be able to withstand these types of pathogen problems, and we'll have a whole list of other things to talk about later in the season.
If you are replanting and you do choose corn this late in the year, is there anything you need to do differently?
Most of the time when we replant corn, often the conditions have changed, and so weather conditions may not be favorable for the same disease again. But if you notice that this is a chronic problem year after year, you might want to take other steps like tiling an area that doesn't drain well, or we don't have any data to support, but possibly an in-furrow fungicide might help since we can't really make seed treatment decisions about corn.
Next week, Tamra will join us again to explain how and why growers can sample for nematodes in corn. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, of course, we dealt with some of the precipitation during the Memorial Day weekend. Thankfully, we didn't see the same areas get repeat performances on heavy precipitation. And then, of course, we've been dealing with a much drier pattern during the middle part of the week. Now, we do have a system that's moving across the northern plains. It has moved across the northern plains over the last 24 hours. That did touch off some precipitation across northern and northeastern Nebraska. And we do have some residual impacts expected this week, at least for the first half. But overall, there are signs that we should see a fairly dry pattern for this next week, which would be good news for many of our producers out there that have still been struggling to get their hay up or to get their crops completely planted. So this does offer at least a break in the situation, and we'll turn our attention late next week to the potential for more systems moving into the western United States that could increase our chances for precipitation once again. So let's get right to the maps, and the first thing we'll draw your attention to is the upper air low that was responsible for some of the severe weather in the northern and central plains yesterday is now moving over into the western Great Lakes region, and we're now getting on the back side of the surface cold front, and so we will see some residual scattered showers at least through the first half of the day in northeast Nebraska, and it may linger a little bit longer depending on how quickly this system decides to exit out to the northeast. But overall, a drier pattern, a little much cooler than the past couple days. We've seen temperatures easily into the 80s and a couple low 90s. Now, as we go into tomorrow, that system deepens over the Great Lakes, and so that's going to bring this ridge much farther to the north. And we'll notice to our west that another system in the southern stream is slowly going to make its way across the central Rockies, and that will become a player later next week. But overall, we're looking for a very nice day on Sunday. Enjoy the weekend. Fairly dry conditions in terms of atmospheric moisture, so we're not going to be dealing with high relative humidity levels. But you'll notice that this ridge starts to build eastward, our temperatures will increase. And here we go on Monday. The system tries to push a little bit farther eastward. We still got a reinforcing area over the Great Lakes, so this is the area that looks to have the most inclement weather. And even there, we're not dealing with a lot of precipitation. And as we go into Tuesday, that system starts to break down. We start to see the ridge building and pushing farther to the east, so we're going to see our temperatures increase rather dramatically. And notice that upper air low that come into California now sitting over the central Rockies, that will start to push some moisture out into the central plains. So we could see some light shower activity to an isolated thunderstorm developing in the panhandle, but outside of that, we're still looking at northwest flow in the upper atmospheres, which means fairly dry weather for most of eastern and central Nebraska. Now on Wednesday, we see that first piece of energy lift out, and this one is directed at South Dakota. So we're looking at for precipitation, Nebraska, the panhandle in north central Nebraska has the best chances for moisture, much less in southeast Nebraska, as we're pretty much right under the center of this ridge. Now as we get into Thursday, the system starts to gain strength as another piece of energy moves into the Pacific Northwest, moves our flow from the southwest in the upper atmosphere, and that's going to a little bit more moisture come into our region. So we're expecting more widespread thunderstorm activity to start developing across the western third of the state. And as we get into Friday, we'll start to see the system pushing across our region, which we could be looking at a severe weather outbreak across the central and northern plains. In terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we will keep the warm conditions in place, and in terms of precipitation, we start to move the precipitation off to our east.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on interest rates and exports, renewable fuel volumes, and corn seedling diseases. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our market analyst, and we'll discuss sampling for nematodes in corn. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.